Wow, that was great, wasn't it? Oh, man, that was so well done. We got a preacher in the making up here. I love it. Anyway, so when we're talking about our sermon today, I was thinking of how am I going to introduce this sermon? Because the title of it, as you can see, if you see in your bulletins, the title of it is Prescription for Affliction. I'm sure many of you have been to the doctors before and you go and get a prescription. You got to get it filled. The doctor says something's wrong, there's a problem in your life, and here's the prescription for it. Now, how many of you are really good at following the doctor's orders? Okay, there's a few of you in there. You're really good at following doctor's orders. I tend not to be, for whatever reason. I have a couple of scripts that have been given to me by doctors, and they're still sitting there, and they're from April. And so, you're like, what am I doing, right? So I think I know better than the doctor. I think, well, I don't really need that, and I'll be okay. But we know the problems that come when we say that kind of stuff. So it kind of leads us perfectly into our sermon today, which is the prescription for affliction. How are we going to cope with difficulties? How are we going to cope when I am afflicted with maybe it's something physically, maybe it's something financially, maybe it's something relationally, whatever it is? How am I going to cope with that? We all have different coping skills. We have different ways that we deal with the problems and difficulties that we face, but there's a prescription in how to deal with it. Now, the question really is, am I going to put the prescription to use? Am I going to actually follow what the doctor's orders are? And we have the doctor's orders. We find them in Scripture to help us deal with affliction. As you know, and I've said this numerous times about Abram, he is the up and down, the ebb and flow, the north and south, the east and west of his faith journey. It's not this straight line. It's all over the place. I mean, just last chapter, we saw great things from Abram. We saw a huge chapter in 15 where he believed and God credited to him for righteousness, that he was in right standing with God. But when we started the story, we see Abram being called, and then we see him falling and sinning, and we see this up and down nature. Well, we had a mountaintop last week. Guess what? We're going into the valley this week on how not to deal with affliction, and then also how to deal with affliction. So let's just do a quick recap for all of my A-plus students out there. Genesis 1-5 speaks of the what? The fall. Okay, you can do better than that. Genesis 1-5 speaks of the fall. Yes. Genesis 6-8 is the flood. Yes. Genesis 9-11 is scatter, which is talking about the Tower of Babel when God confused their languages. And Genesis 12-50, here's the one that I changed. If you remember from last week, I said it changed, but it really didn't. It did change this week. It's patriarchs. And so patriarchs, we'll say it together, 1, 2, 3. Patriarchs looks at Abram, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Those are the four main characters that we see in Genesis 12-50. We're just looking at Abram's life, who turns to Abraham. And so a quick recap, we see 12-25 Abraham, call and fall, chapter 12, 13, the separation with Lot and Abram, chapter 14, the battles, the king's battles, the 4 kings versus 5 kings, and Abram, how he whoops up there. And then we see chapter 15 last week. And I misspoke last week. I was referring to Abram being around 90 years old. In the Genesis 15 account, he's actually around 77. So I was off by about 17 years, and you'll see this week that correction. But Genesis 15, and you see the covenant that God made with Abram and how he saved Abram's soul. And that moves us into chapter 16, dealing with affliction. And most of the things we're going to see Sarai and Abram and how they dealt with affliction the wrong way. They dealt with it man's way. And then we're going to see this heathen person or this person that doesn't know the one true God, we're going to see her have an experience with God and actually deal with affliction God's way. So God does this. It's the same way maybe some of you grandparents can relate when you're watching your kids parent, and you're watching your kids parent, and you see some different things that they're doing, and then you hear from your grandkids, and you're like, man, you guys are smart. The grandkids are smart. My kid, I don't know what he's doing parenting, but my grandkids are smart. And so you have that because you can step back and see the whole picture. And that's the benefit of what we get to do today. This has all already happened. And so we can step back and say, how am I going to deal with affliction? How am I going to deal with difficult circumstances? Well, you got one of two ways, and we're going to see it come right out of our text today. If you have your bulletin, on the back of your bulletin, you'll see an outline there. And we actually only have 2 observations to make. So that means it'll be a shorter sermon, hopefully, but probably not. Number 1, the first observation that we see is man's way of coping with affliction produces what? Problems. Produces problems. Man's way of coping with affliction produces problems. And we're going to start our story here in Genesis 16, verses 1 to 2a. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Now, there's a little bit that we need to understand here about the culture. The culture in this time frame of the basically 1900 time frame BC is that if the wife could not bear children, she would then provide another wife to have children with her husband. You might say, that is crazy. It was something that was commonplace in this time period. It also was commonplace in Hammurabi's time frame, which would have been around 1600 BC. They wrote things into law in regards to surrogacy. And so this was sometimes you know how they have prenuptial agreements now in our culture, but the prenup would have been, if you can't have kids, you're going to provide another woman so that we can have kids. Can you imagine wives signing something like that? You're like, I ain't marrying that guy. He's a creep. That's the way you would think. Yet in this society, this was commonplace. This was man's way of dealing with barrenness. You see, barrenness was associated with being cursed. Having children or being fertile was connected with being blessed by God. So that's how they looked at it. I remember we were on a cruise, I want to say maybe in 2010 time frame, and we went to Mexico. How many of you ever been to Mexico? Yep, a lot of people have been to Mexico. And it's great to come back from Mexico, yes. And so we were there in Mexico, and while we were there, we went and visited the Aztec culture, or the Mayan culture, and everything surrounded this main temple area of worship. And you know what it was all about? It was all about fertility. That's why that became the top priority in these cultures. And so it was a top priority in this culture. And that's why this would have been a normal action. Of course, us looking at it in our Western culture, we would say this would never be a normal action. Well, you kind of have to step back from what's normal to us and look and see this is what was normal for them. I'm sure there's things that are normal for us, like a bathroom, that's probably not normal for them back then, right? So anyway, you can kind of see that this is a cultural thing. And now let's look at Sarai's words. Her words are what? The Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Now, if we just go back a chapter, we see that God created a covenant that only He could fulfill. And this would have been when they were about 77 years old. In this chapter, chapter 16, they're about 85. Abram's 85 and Sarai 75. So last chapter, Genesis 15, Abram's about 77 and Sarai's about 67. So God promised them, You are going to have land and you are going to have children. It's the two things, the two most valuable things that they could ever have. And this is the context. This is the story. Of course, Moses, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is writing the first 5 books of the Bible. He's writing Genesis here, and he's sharing with the tension of the story. They haven't had any kids yet, and it's been almost 10 years. It's been all this time, and they still don't have kids. Like, there's a problem. There's an issue. There's an affliction. They are looked upon as something's wrong with you. And so there's this problem. And so Sarai, what does she do? She looks at God and blames him. So Sarai blames God and says, you have prevented me. God has prevented me from having children. This is God's fault. He said that he was going to give us children, and he hasn't after these many years. And that's our first, really, our observation with man's way. The first thing that we do when we cope with affliction man's way is we nurture a critical spirit. We begin to facilitate a critical and judgmental spirit where we set ourselves up as the judge, jury, and executioner. We begin to nurture this critical spirit. Let me give you an idea of what the critical spirit is all about. The critical spirit comes out of a root of bitterness, Hebrews 12:15. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. This critical spirit is a root of bitterness, and it's rooted in being bitter. Somehow your expectations aren't met. Somehow God didn't do what he was supposed to do. Somehow my husband didn't do what he was supposed to do. Somehow my wife didn't do what she was supposed to do. Somehow my kids didn't do what they were supposed to do. Somehow my employees or my employer didn't do what they're supposed to do. And if we don't deal with that, that will grow. And that grows into a critical spirit where we begin to lay out criticisms to people that are unfair. But that's because there's an unmet expectation. There's this bitterness that is growing inside of us. Matthew 7:1-2 is a great command. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. It is not our place to judge another person. That is God's place. Yet we love to step in and be God and tell people all the problems that they have in their life. And we can fix all theirs while we have all the problems in our own life. That's why if you read further, you see that only when I remove the 2x4 that is in my own eye, the 2x4 that I have in my own eye, now I can deal, sorry to pick on Greg just sitting there, now I can help Greg deal with the speck that's in his. So if I'm walking around with a 2x4 sticking out of my head, how can I help him? I can't, right? So I have to first judge myself. I have to deal with myself. A critical spirit passes over all that. A critical spirit has 2x4s in your eyes, and you can't see clear to help anyone. But this critical spirit comes about. And there's a couple of ways you can identify this in a person and in yourself. The first way is you're thankless. You don't have an attitude of gratitude. You're not thankful for what God has done. You're not thankful for what people do. It's all expectations. It's all being entitled, right? We don't really like being around people who are entitled. They think everything should be handed to them. We don't like that. Why? It's a critical spirit, and it's not God's way. It's man's way of coping with difficulty. So they have a thankless issue, and then they have a selfish issue. Everything revolves around them. They're never concerned about the affair or the issues of someone else. They're never concerned about what's happening in other people's lives. They just want to share with you everything that's happening in their own life. You can tell that they have a critical spirit, that they are they're selfish, they're myopic. They can only see themselves. It's as if they walk around with a mirror in front of their face. They can't see anything else that is going on. The next is they're insecure. That's really part of the issue, is they're insecure in their relationship with God. They're insecure in their relationship with others. And so therefore now they have to fight for value. They have to fight for worth. They have to prove themselves. And so this insecurity is a poison in relationships. And it's a poison towards at work. And it's a poison in a marriage. And this is what creeped in to Abram and Sarai's marriage. And she now has this critical spirit. I saw this on the internet the other day, and I was thinking, boy, this really hits home. Critical words eat holes in tender souls. Critical words eat holes in tender souls. How are you speaking? How are you handling your words to other people? Are they critical? If they're critical, you got to take a step back and say, I'm afflicted somewhere in my life I'm afflicted, somewhere I have an unmet expectation, somewhere I have a difficulty, and I'm taking that out on other people. And it's wrong, and it's man's way, and all I'm going to do is create problems. That's all I'm going to do in my life. So critical words eat holes in tender souls. Let's continue on. So we see this critical spirit being developed by Sarai. So now she comes up with man's way of solving the problem. She comes up with, this is the cultural method. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. As I explained before, this is the culture. And Abram, what did he do? Listened to the voice of Sarai. Come on, Abe. Come on, where are you at? You should have remembered what happened in the garden. Adam standing there like a big dope. And Eve talking to a serpent. And Adam's like, oh, yeah, this is fine. No big deal. It's a problem. And he's just standing there like, And then Eve sees the fruit and says, this looks good, Adam. Hey, you want to try it? Yeah, let's do it. What are you doing, Adam? Abram doing the same thing. He's just sitting back. And I was trying to relate to this because I'm thinking, you know what? I do this probably all the time. I just don't see it in myself because I'm not looking at myself. And I was thinking, you know what? This is so easy to spot in ourselves. And for men especially, for men to abdicate their leadership at home. And we do this all the time because our wives step up in amazing ways. How many of you men have a great wife that you're married to? You better raise both hands. Anyway, so we get so consumed, us men, we get so consumed with what's going on outside the home. We're consumed with it. We're consumed with work or with leading at work, or we're consumed with sports teams, and we're consumed with hobbies, and we get consumed with all these things on the outside of the home. Abram, no different than us. Abram's got to lead a whole family. He's got an army. He's got workers all over the place. He's managing people. He's got his own business, basically. He's doing everything. And so when he comes home, what does he want to do? He wants to relax. He wants to unplug. He wants to just chill out because he's spent everything that he had on outside of the home things. This is the same thing us men do because we base our value on the outside of the home instead of on the inside of the home. That's why Abram was like, sure, whatever you want to do. He probably wasn't even listening. Sure, whatever, Sayre. That sounds good. Oh, you want to have another wife? Yeah, it sounds good to me. That's cultural, okay. It's acceptable. It's fine. It's okay. The world says it's okay. This is how you handle infertility. So this is what we're going to do. And Abram fails to lead. He sits there and just says, okay, sounds good. Listen to the wife that God had given to him in a sinful way. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, again, this was about 7 or 8 years after chapter 15. This was 10 years after they arrived in Genesis chapter 12 in the land of Canaan. So this is now a statement Moses is making in the passage. Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, gave her to her husband Abram as wife. Now, let's just look at another nuance of this passage. Considering all the things that have taken place, who led them to Egypt? Abram. Abram led his family to Egypt. Why, you might say? Because there was famine in the land. So what do? We have to go to where the food is. That makes sense. Abram leads his family to Egypt Pharaoh blesses his family in amazing ways, but that's where Hagar comes from. Hagar now comes back with the family. Now they've been 7 or 8 years waiting for God to act. God doesn't act. Sarai says it's going to be this way. Abram's like, yeah, whatever you want, honey. Yeah, sure, whatever you want. And he now acts, and he sins. He sins against God because it's not an act of faith. It's just creating a problem, and we're going to see more problems in this passage. But what do we see? We see this. We manipulate others to side with us. We develop that critical spirit, and then we manipulate others to side with us. This idea of manipulation is described this way. We cross lines that we have no business crossing. We take on God's responsibilities instead of letting God be God. And so we cross lines, we cross boundary lines. What else? We blame others. We blame other people, just like Sayre. She was blaming God for the predicament. And now she crossed the line saying, you know what, God? I don't think you can make this happen. I don't think you can make me pregnant because I was 67 and now I'm 77. I don't think I'm going to have any children. I don't think it's going to happen. And so I'm going to blame other people. I'm going to cross lines. And this is what happens. Now she manipulates and says, my way only. It's got to be my way only. Frank Sinatra sings a song way back in the day, I did it my way. There's a problem inherently with that thinking, is because it ignores God's way and how to do life. My way only. That's to recognize someone who is manipulative, someone who's trying to control you, someone who's trying to get you to do something that you shouldn't be doing. You need to be aware of this. Teenagers, be aware of this. You will see people that will cross lines, they'll blame other people and say, my way only, and they'll say it in deceptive ways to get you to do things that you have no business doing. Look at Philippians 2:3. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. And you see Sarai working her way down this path, a critical spirit, now being manipulative. Now we see Genesis 16:4-6. He went into Hagar and she conceived, so made her his wife. Now he's got 2 wives. When she saw that she had conceived, her mistress, which was Sarai, was despised in her sight. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done me be upon you. Look at this manipulative behavior. If any of you have been married, you have seen husbands and wives be manipulative towards their wife or towards their spouse. I gave my maid into your arms, Abram. But when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. And Abram, it's your fault. And you're thinking, wait a second, wasn't this Sarai's idea to begin with? Wasn't this what Sarai thought would be the best decision? Because the culture does it. The world does it. It makes sense. It's like, yeah, this is a good idea. Not counting the emotional cost. Not counting the spiritual cost. Not counting even the relationship costs. There's all these costs that they didn't consider. And now they're in a worse predicament. Now Hagar, who was looked upon as a servant in the home, has elevated status. She is now a wife. And not only is she a wife, she's a pregnant wife, which was a sign of blessing. And now she begins to look down on Sarai. And Sarai's like, I'm having no part of this. Deal with it, Abram. Get her out of here. And he's like, oh, geez. I guess I should have been paying more attention to my home than what was outside of my home. And so we see some conviction by Abram here, and even in our own lives. Look at this verse. The strength of what's happening here, Solomon wrote about this in Proverbs under 3 things. I believe it was Solomon. Under 3 things, the earth quakes. And he's using a hyperbole or wild language. And under 4, it cannot bear up. Under a slave when he becomes a king. Maybe you've seen this in your own life. You see a person that they were an employee and they become the manager and then they start treating people poorly. They had no business being in management. When he becomes a king, a fool when he is satisfied with food. Someone who's not interested in working, when they are filled with food, they continue to be lazy. They continue to not operate with discipline. Under an unloved woman, when she gets a husband, and a maidservant when she supplants her mistress. 4 gigantic, huge things that cannot be overcome. This is what Solomon is saying, the most wise person to ever walk on planet Earth besides Jesus says this, that the same situation that's happening right now, I'm sure Solomon thought of Abram, Sarai, and Hagar when he wrote this. This cannot be. This is too much to bear. This is too big of an issue. And we see the scriptures there in Proverbs 30. We continue on. May the Lord judge between you and me. Sarai now being manipulative, basically saying to Abram, you led us to Egypt. You were wrong in leading us to Egypt. And I'm just trying to support God's plan. I'm just trying. God said he's going to promise us a seed and he's going to promise us descendants. And I'm just trying to go along with God's plan. You were way outside of bounds by going to Egypt. And so let's have God judge who is more right and who is more wrong. Woohoo, Sarai. Wow. Man, no wonder Abram is staying outside a lot. Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. Look at Abram just falling and not leading, saying, whatever you want, Sarah. Do whatever you want. I'll bet we have guys in here that say that all the time to their wife. And wives just, it doesn't lead them to believe that you care for them. It doesn't. It just means you just want them to get away from you. That's what it means. And so Abram doing the same thing, just saying, whatever you want to do, Sarai, whatever you want to do, you just do it. I have too much to deal with. Man, Abram, get with the program here. It's easy to say that because I think the same way about my own life. And so, behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. Letter C, we become difficult when we lose control of the situation. Sarai, thinking that she's in control of the situation, suggested to Abram, her husband, exactly what to do. He goes along with it. She develops a critical spirit, has manipulative tendencies, and now falls into being a difficult person. A difficult person. We become difficult when we lose control of the situation. Sarai has completely lost control of the situation. Now Hagar is pregnant in her home and is looking down at Sarai, saying, you're not as valuable as me. I carry Abram's seed. I carry that. And I have more value than you. And Sarai cannot handle it. She loses her brain. And this is what happens when we become a difficult person. These are some areas of difficult people. Someone who's a downer. Someone who's always down about everything in life. There was a skit on Saturday Night Live that was Debbie Downer. Not to be offensive to anyone's name who's Debbie. But Debbie Downer, why? She would find the negative no matter what was going on. No matter what was going on, she would find the negative part of it. My name tag's not staying on. She would find that, the downer, the person who's always down on everything. Another difficult person is the better-thans. They're always sharing about how they're better than someone else. The one-uppers. They always are sharing how great everything is in their life and how they are better at life than all the rest of the people on planet Earth. You don't want to hang with them too much, that's for sure. The downers and the better-thans. The passives. The passives, they sit in a corner. They don't say anything. They're usually insecure. They don't want to be rejected, so they have very little or few relationships, and they operate their life in a passive way. This is a difficult person to deal with, especially if you have a passive person on your staff. Hard to get them motivated, hard to get them doing things, so a passive person is a difficult person. And then we all know the aggressives. The aggressive people are difficult to deal with. this all falls into a difficult person. When you become a difficult person, it can be any four of these areas that you falter in. But look at what God's word says, Philippians 2:4. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. See, when you're a difficult person, you stopped looking at the personal needs of other people. You're only looking at your life. All right, let's close out this section. So Sarai treated her with kindness. No, no, no. See that critical spirit, manipulative tendencies. She became a difficult person, and now she's treating people poorly. So Sarai treated her harshly, and Hagar fled from her presence. So Hagar ran away, pregnant by Abraham, or by Abram, runs away. So we finish this section. We begin to treat others poorly. This was all in a way to cope with affliction, in a way to cope with the difficulties of their life, with the difficulty of barrenness. This was to solve the problem. But guess what? It didn't solve it at all. It just added to the problem and made it more complex. When we do things our way, when we do things the world's way, when we solve problems with worldly wisdom, we continue to create problems. And we will continue to do that until we allow God's way to have order in our life. You can see Ephesians 4:29-30. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as good for building up, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give what to people? Grace to those who hear. Do not grieve the Holy Spirit, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness, wrath, there's that root of bitterness, wrath, anger, and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice, evil. But be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you. Sarai, walking down that pathway, is now dishonoring God in her life. And this is what happens when we try to cope with affliction man's way. Number two, our second observation. God's way of coping with affliction produces maturity. God's way of coping with affliction produces maturity. So let me get a raise of hands. How many want to cause problems when they deal with affliction? Good. How many want to grow spiritually and become mature? Yes, everyone's hand. Very good. So very few people sleeping out there. Very good. God's way of coping with affliction produces maturity. We'll continue on here, verses 7 and 8. Now the angel of the Lord. There is a little bit of debate as to who this is, but you can study this in Judges. You can study this later in Genesis. And you can see the angel of the Lord, or the angel of Yahweh, was certainly God himself. Some would say it would be a theophany. I certainly believe that it would be a Christophany, which would have been Jesus before he came to earth and was born. So we call it the pre-incarnate Christ. And the angel of the Lord, and here's Jesus, I would say. Again, I hold these things with open hand. So Jesus is here and finds her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to shore. So Hagar runs away. She doesn't really know where she's going. She just runs away, trying to get away, right? We do that sometimes with affliction. We just want to get away from it. We just want to get away from it all. We just want to run away. And this is what Hagar does. She runs away, but who meets her? Jesus. Who meets us when we run away? Jesus. Every time he will meet us. And this idea here, or this location of the way to Shur, is really she headed in the direction of Egypt. It's where her homeland is, but it's always the sign of the flesh. It's a sign of doing the world's way, doing it the world's way. So heading that direction to Egypt is fleshly decision. Heading back to my roots of living in the flesh, that's the significance that it has, that Hagar is heading that direction. And who stops her along the way? She's getting something to drink. Now, I didn't share this with you before, but one of the rules, or one of the laws of the land during this time period, was if you had a slave, or you had this woman and she supplanted the mistress or she did something wrong to the head wife, then they could put, I think this is where they get the idea of washing someone's mouth out with soap. Because according to the law, she could actually put a quart of salt in her mouth. That's gross. I don't know if that happened or not. We don't know. But that was certainly the time period of where that could happen, and maybe that's why found her at the well, possibly. I don't know. But that might be where we get the whole idea of washing your mouth out with soap. Anyone ever had their mouth washed out with soap? Yeah, quite a few of you. Yeah. Got a bunch of sinners in here. Anyway, he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? Jesus, it's funny, right? This is just a unique situation that he comes on the scene. He doesn't say, I just want to let you know I love you. Let me give you a hug. He doesn't do that. He wants her to go through this process of dealing with affliction. And she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress, Sarai. So he asked her two questions, and she says, I'm fleeing away. I'm running away from my affliction. What is the first thing that we learn here? God helps us glance back in order to look ahead. How many of you got a rear view mirror in your car? All right, very good. How many of you drive with that rear view mirror and you just stare in it the whole time you're driving? Nobody. Oh, my goodness. Nobody. Nobody. Yes, new drivers are like, yeah, I guess I'm supposed to do that. Only if you're going backwards. But we are to glance back, and this is what Jesus is doing. God is asking her to glance back, to look back to see where she came from. Glance back to see what she's running from, to glance back to view the situation that she's in, to view the affliction that she's in, to glance back, not in order to stay looking back, but in order to look forward. Because these two questions. The first is, where did you come from? Where are you going? That's so key for us. If we're going to move forward in our life, we have to glance back to see the past. And we don't stay there. Some people are glancing back all the time, and they stay there, and they never accomplish anything because they're stuck in the past. But we are to glance back, just to take a quick look. Okay, that's where I'm at. Just like when you're driving, you take a quick look back so you can switch lanes. Hopefully you're doing that. You're using your mirrors so you can operate. This is the whole idea. Glance back, make sure I don't make a mistake moving forward. Look at Philippians 3, 13 and 14. Brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead. The Apostle Paul, he's not saying never look back, but what he's saying is put it in the past and leave it there. I know what it is. I understand what it is, but I am moving forward. I'm not going to continue to look back at it. I'm moving forward. So I've identified what the issue is. I've identified the affliction. I've identified the hurt. I've identified the pain. I've identified the offense. And now I'm going to push forward. I'm not going to allow that situation to make me a victim in my life. And we have victims walking around all over the place in our world today, in our churches, in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces. And they are handicapped to move forward because they're stuck in the past. I'm not saying there's easy things to deal with, but they're necessary to deal with those things in the past. That's what the Apostle Paul is saying. Why do we look back, or why do we glance back? To avoid the same mistakes. Let's avoid the same things that we continue to do wrong. We look back at a situation to say, why do I keep messing up? Well, let me look back at that situation, understand it, what I thought my expectation was, or what it's supposed to be. Avoid the same mistakes. Now I can anticipate the future. I can anticipate of what's coming up or what's going to happen in my life. It doesn't mean I know the future, but I can anticipate it in a certain situation because I've lived through it. I've trusted God through that situation. I'm coping with my affliction God's way, and so now I can anticipate what's coming. Next is I can build on the successes of previous decisions. This is a very good thing. I can build on that. I've made good decisions. This is something that we teach our children, right? They make a good decision in school. They make a good decision at home. And what do? We want to praise that. We want them to build on that. Not forget it, but to build on it. So we glance back at their past. The problem is if you continue to look back at your past and you continue to look at all your successes, you won't have much success going forward because you'll just be reading the clippings from the newspaper about how great you are, and you'll never move forward. That's a problem as well. Learn from others. As we glance back, we can learn from the mistakes of others. Let's continue on. Genesis 16:9. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, this is Jesus said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. What? No, this can't be the right decision. But it is. This is God's way of coping with affliction. His way is God insists on obedience through submission. He insists on obedience. If you're going to deal with your affliction and you're going to cope with your affliction, you're going to cope with your difficulty, that means you're going to need to submit yourself to God's way. You're going to have to obey God's way. And he was telling Hagar, you need to go back. You need to go back. You need to put yourself back in that situation. Oh, that doesn't feel good. Most of us want to get out of the issue. We want out. We don't want to feel pain. We want to be comfortable. Yet God's way for us to truly deal with that affliction is to go back in it. Now, I am not saying that you go back into an abusive relationship or anything like that. Please don't take that to mean that way. What I'm talking about is it might be a physical affliction. It might be a relational thing at work or whatever. Not abuse. I'm not talking about abuse. You don't submit yourself to abuse. You call the police. That's what you do. God insists on obedience through submission. Look at Matthew 7:24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them, this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus speaking with many people, and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. This is the idea of submitting to God's way. It's okay, God, I'm going to do things your way. And what does God promise? He promises that now your life will be built on the rock. It will be able to sustain and be able to handle storms and be able to handle the difficulties that come in your life, the affliction that comes. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. The angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael. This meaning God sees or God hears, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. How many of you have a son that's like a wild donkey? A wild donkey of a man, he's crazy. I think they say he will have ADHD. No, I'm just kidding. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live to the east of all of his brothers. So now, once she adjusts herself to submit and obey, now God gives her promises. God blesses her and tells her that this son will be Ishmael. He will be, God heard you in your affliction. That's what Ishmael means. And now not only will he hear you in your affliction, he's going to bless you. And so you're going to go back and you're going to be blessed in that home. But you will understand that this son will have the life that you want. This son will have the life. The life you want, Hagar, is to be free because you're a slave and you want freedom. Guess what? Your son will have that life. You will not, but your son will. This is the promise that he's giving to Ishmael. Now, Ishmael is also going to be free, but he's going to be in a lot of conflicts. He's going to be a fighter. He's going to be a Bedouin, which basically a tent stayer, and he's going to have a big group of he's going to have quite a big family. As you look at his history and you look at genealogies, you'll find that, Esau, you know Esau, Jacob and Esau, Isaac's two boys. Esau actually marries one of Ishmael's daughters. And so their cousins get married there. I don't recommend that today, but this is what would happen back then. So you can see the connection between Esau, who is another picture of the flesh. Ishmael, the way he is living, is a picture of the flesh. And so two fleshly people coming together there, Esau and Methulah, something like that. I can't remember. But anyway, and you're going to live to the east of all his brothers. To live to the east meant to live in the flesh, to live the world's way. That was what moving to the east meant. So you have this idea that Ishmael is going to live worldly, but he's going to be free. He's going to be free. He's going to have lots of conflict, but he's going to live apart from Abraham's seed. God's promises help stabilize us. You see, where Hagar's being encouraged, now you need to obey, you need to submit, and then she is given a promise, and that helps stabilize her. That helps give her confidence in God. Look at Psalm 62:2. He only is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I shall not be greatly shaken. When we choose to do things God's way, this is what God does for us. He brought me up out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay, and he set my feet upon a rock, making my footsteps firm. Hebrews 6:19, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil. For those of us who have received Jesus Christ as our personal Savior, he puts us upon the rock. He secures our salvation within the veil as he goes into the Holy of Holies, where God the Father dwelt, and he made that relationship possible between us and God the Father. That's what he's talking about within the veil. He's protecting us. We have eternal security. That's what God promises. So no matter what we're going through, no matter what challenge or difficulty or affliction we have, as a Christian, as a believer, we look that God's got this in the end, no matter what I'm going through right now. I can rely for God to come through in the end. No matter if I have to deal with this affliction the rest of my life, this is what God has provided for us. Verses 13 and 14, quickly now. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered, meaning God sees, or the living one by the well, God sees. That's what it's talking about. That's what she's rephrasing there. And so she has an intimate connection with God. And I believe it's Jesus there, connecting with Hagar. And what does God do? God reveals more of himself to us. As we submit to him, we choose to obey him. We choose to glance back, to look forward, and we submit to what he wants. We gladly submit to affliction. James counted all joy when I enter into diverse trials and tribulation. I will count this joy because I'm going to have more of God revealed to me. What does the Apostle Paul says? In his weakness, God's grace is his strength. It's poured over all the scriptures here that it's the opposite of the world's way. The world's way is strength, strength, strength. God's way is be weak, I'll be your strength. God reveals more of himself to us. And certainly that day in the wilderness with Hagar, she had an unbelievable experience with God. God revealed himself to her in an unbelievable way. Look at Exodus 34. I don't have time to read all this, but this is when God revealed himself to Moses, and Moses hiding in the cleft of the rock, and God walking by, floating by, sharing with him what he's all about. I'm forgiving and gracious and slow to anger. I'm abounding in mercy and truth, and I will forgive iniquities, but I also will punish unforgiven sin. I will deal with that. I will deal with the guilty. I will deal with the problems that people have if they don't confess their sin. And this is what Moses is saying. And then you see Matthew 17, the transfiguration. You see God revealing himself, Jesus revealing himself for who he truly is to Peter, James, and John. If you go back and you remember the story of Jesus walking on the water, the Bible says that he desired to reveal himself to all of them. That was his desire. I want to reveal to all the disciples who I am. But why didn't he do it? Because they didn't act in faith. It was Peter stepping out in faith. The rest of them were scared to death. And so that's why he did not reveal himself. Yet we see later he took Peter, James, and John and revealed himself who he truly was, that he was the Son of God. This is what God does when you do things his way. He allows you to see more of himself from the scriptures, more of himself operating in this world, you begin to see things spiritually. You begin to see that God is at work. If you're just constantly living in the flesh and constantly living a carnal life, you will never see God work. But as you make choices to serve God and submit to Him, you will have a new connection with God. And that's what Hagar experienced. And we close out our story. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his child, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. And so we close our story out with a brand new baby who is not the promised descendant, but with a brand new baby in their life. Now it's Sarai and Hagar. Abram's got 2 wives, and he's got this son, Ishmael. And Isaac, the promised son, would not be born until Abram was 100 years of age. And so we've got another time to wait before Isaac comes along. But that's the story is this: God bestows blessing in His time beyond our expectation. For Hagar, she was going to run away, run back to Egypt, run back to the flesh, do things her own way, have a child out of wedlock, probably have a horrible life back there in Egypt. Yet she chose to come back and face the affliction, and God blessed her with Ishmael, blessed her with a destiny of this, and blessed her with this story that we look back on Hagar and say, wow, that's how you do it. That's how you do things God's way when you're afflicted. Not Sarai's way, but Hagar's way. I close with this verse, 3:20. Now to Him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us. See, as you do things God's way, He blesses you beyond what your expectations are. He blesses you beyond what you think you should have or what you think you should be able to accomplish. He blesses you exceedingly and abundantly beyond what you think. So think of the greatest blessing. God goes beyond that when you do things His way. So as you do things His way, as you cope with affliction, you produce maturity in your life. You produce godly spiritual wisdom in your life. I close with this phrase: endure to mature. Endure through the affliction to mature. That is how we deal with affliction God's way. We're actually going to move into our communion time now. And as we move towards communion, I've asked the praise team to sing a song. And this song is called "We're Thankful for the Scars." Maybe you've heard of it. But we're going to look at this verse, 1 Corinthians 11:28. And on this verse, it talks about, but a man must examine himself. And so now, before we come to the table, this song, I just want you to close your eyes. If you want to sing along, you can. If you want to kneel, whatever you want to do, feel free to do. But this is a time to examine your heart. Examine your life. Examine your life the past month, the past week. And remember what Christ has done for you. Thanks, Patrice.